A tale of werewolves, alphas, and fated destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The forest was quiet in that particular way that made Luna Silvercrest's survival instincts scream at her to turn back, to retreat to her cottage, to lock the door and wait out whatever was coming. But she ignored those instincts the same way she'd been ignoring common sense for the past 2 years of living alone in the Whispering Woods, surviving on stubbornness and the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow would be the day she stopped feeling like a ghost haunting her own life. The sky had been clear when she'd left her small, crumbling cottage 3 hours ago, her woven basket slung over one arm and her harvesting knife tucked into her belt, determined to gather the last of the winter berries before the first hard freeze turned them bitter and useless. But now, dark clouds were rolling in from the north with a speed that felt unnatural, almost malicious, and the temperature was dropping so fast she could see her breath forming silver clouds in the increasingly frigid air that seemed to be pressing down on her like a physical weight. She should have turned back an hour ago when the first wisps of those ominous clouds had appeared on the horizon, should have abandoned her half-filled basket and run for the safety of her cottage with its patched roof and smoking chimney. But Luna had learned over the past 2 years of isolation that sometimes you had to take risks if you wanted to survive the winter, and winter berries were essential for the fever-reducing tonic she'd need when the inevitable illness came with the cold months, so she'd pressed on, ignoring the warning signs that any sensible wolf would have heeded, telling herself she had time, lying to herself the way she'd been lying for so long about so many things. Her silver hair, hanging loose down her back in a long braid that reached her waist, was already collecting snowflakes from the first tentative flurries that had begun falling about 10 minutes ago, each delicate crystal catching the fading afternoon light and making her look even more like the ghost people had always claimed she was. The cursed Omega with hair like death and eyes like winter storms. Too pale, too strange, too different to ever truly belong anywhere or to anyone. The wind picked up suddenly, violently, and Luna had to grab onto a nearby oak tree to keep from being knocked off her feet by the sheer force of it, her basket swinging wildly and nearly spilling the precious berries she'd spent hours collecting from the thorny bushes that grew in the deepest parts of the forest where most wolves feared to venture. This wasn't a normal storm, she realized with a cold dread that had nothing to do with the plummeting temperature and everything to do with the way the wind seemed to be howling with an intelligence behind it, almost as if something or someone was controlling it, directing it, using it as a weapon to trap anyone foolish enough to be caught out in the open when it finally unleashed its full fury. Dark magic, whispered a small voice in the back of her mind, the same voice that had warned her about so many dangers over the years, the intuitive sense that had kept her alive when being cursed and unwanted should have killed her a dozen times over, and she knew with absolute certainty that she needed to find shelter immediately, or she wouldn't survive the next hour. Luna turned in a slow circle, trying to orient herself in the rapidly deteriorating visibility, squinting through the snow that was now falling so thick and fast that she could barely see 10 feet in front of her face. And she realized, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, that she'd wandered farther from her cottage than she'd thought, had somehow gotten turned around in her determination to fill her basket. And now, she had no idea which direction would lead her home and which would lead her deeper into the wilderness where she'd freeze to death before dawn. The panic that rose in her throat tasted like copper and fear, but she forced it down with the practice of someone who'd been surviving on her own for far too long, forced herself to think instead of simply react, forced herself to remember the survival training her parents had given her before they died in that rogue attack 17 years ago, when she was only 5 years old and still believed the world might have a place for a little girl with silver hair and violet gray eyes that changed color depending on the light. That's when she heard it, cutting through the howling wind and the sound of her own ragged breathing and the hammering of her heart against her ribs like a desperate prisoner trying to escape. A sound that made every instinct she possessed scream at her to run in the opposite direction, because wolves howling in a storm like this meant danger, meant territory disputes, or rogue attacks, or something even worse. But there was something wrong about these howls, something that made her healer's heart clench with recognition, even before her mind could fully process what she was hearing. Because these weren't the howls of wolves hunting or fighting or marking territory. These were howls of distress, of pain, of creatures in desperate need of help. And Luna had never been able to walk away from suffering, no matter how much sense it would make, no matter how many times that compassion had gotten her hurt or rejected or blamed for things that weren't her fault. She followed the sound against every ounce of self-preservation she possessed, stumbling through the deepening snow that was already up to her ankles and climbing higher with every passing minute. Her thin cloak doing absolutely nothing to protect her from the wind that seemed determined to strip the warmth from her body and leave her as frozen and empty as everyone had always claimed she was inside. The howling grew louder, more desperate, and she realized with a start that there were multiple wolves, at least a dozen from the different pitches and tones she could distinguish, even through the chaos of the storm, and they were all in trouble, all crying out for help that probably wasn't coming, because what fool would venture into a magical storm to help strange wolves who could just as easily tear her apart as accept her aid? Luna Silvercrest, apparently, was exactly that kind of fool, the kind who'd spent 2 years alone in the woods, talking to robins and squirrels, just to remember what conversation felt like. The kind who'd been rejected and banished and called cursed so many times that she'd stopped counting. The kind who had nothing left to lose except a life that hadn't felt worth living for longer than she wanted to admit. She pushed through a dense thicket of brambles that tore at her cloak and scratched her pale skin with thorns that left thin lines of blood welling up on her arms, barely feeling the pain through the numbness that was starting to creep into her fingers and toes. The first dangerous sign of hypothermia setting in, and then she was through the brambles and standing in front of a rocky outcropping she'd never seen before, despite 2 years of exploring these woods. A formation that seemed to appear out of nowhere with a dark cave entrance that looked like a mouth opened in a silent scream. The howling was coming from inside the cave, and Luna didn't let herself think about all the reasons why entering a cave full of strange wolves during a magical storm was possibly the worst decision she could make. Didn't let herself remember what had happened the last time she'd trusted wolves who weren't her pack. Didn't let herself consider that she might be walking into a trap, or an ambush, or her own death. She stepped into the cave entrance and stopped dead, her breath catching in her throat and her basket falling from nerveless fingers to clatter on the stone floor. Winterberries spilling everywhere in a scatter of dark purple against gray rock, because the sight in front of her was unlike anything she'd ever seen in her 22 years of life. 12 wolves, massive and magnificent with white and silver fur that seemed to glow even in the dim light filtering through the cave entrance, were arranged in a loose defensive circle around something in the center, and every single one of them was injured in some way, with blood matting their pristine coats and bodies trembling from cold despite fur that should have kept them warm in any natural winter storm. These weren't ordinary wolves, Luna realized immediately, taking in their size and coordination, and the way they moved with military precision, even while wounded. These were elite warriors, probably guards for some important alpha. caught in an ambush and fighting for their lives in a storm that had been designed to kill them. She should run, should leave them to whatever fate the moon goddess had planned for them, should save herself and forget she'd ever seen this because getting involved with pack politics was dangerous and she was nobody, nothing, a cursed Omega with no allies and no protection. But then the wolves shifted slightly, responding to her presence with wary alertness, and Luna saw what they'd been protecting in the center of their defensive formation, saw the massive silver wolf that was clearly their leader based on size alone, easily 4 feet tall at the shoulder with a thick ruff of fur around his neck and a bearing that screamed alpha even in his obvious distress. He was the most magnificent wolf she'd ever seen, with a coat that looked like liquid silver in the flickering light. But something was terribly wrong with him because he was moving erratically, jerking and stumbling like a newborn pup who hadn't learned coordination yet, running into the cave walls with sickening thuds that made Luna wince in sympathetic pain. And there was blood, so much blood, streaming from a deep wound in his shoulder that was clearly infected and spreading poison through his system. That's when she saw his eyes, when the alpha turned in her direction at the sound of her dropped basket, and Luna's heart broke into 1,000 pieces at what she witnessed in that moment of recognition. His eyes, which should have been clear and focused, and the brilliant ice blue common to northern alphas, were clouded gray, filmed over with a milky opacity that spoke of blindness, of a wolf who couldn't see what was in front of him, who was panicking because he couldn't navigate his environment, couldn't protect himself, couldn't fight or flee, or do any of the things an alpha was supposed to do to keep his pack safe. The other wolves were trying to help him, trying to guide him with gentle nudges and soft whines, but they were all too injured and too exhausted to do more than keep him from seriously hurting himself as he stumbled and crashed into walls in his disoriented state. Luna moved before conscious thought could stop her. Moved with the same instinct that had made her follow the howling into the storm. Moved with the healer's heart that had always been her greatest weakness and her most powerful strength. And she spoke in a soft, gentle voice that cut through the chaos of growls and whimpers and labored breathing like a beam of moonlight through storm clouds. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear making her hands shake and her heart race, projecting calm and safety and healing, intent the way her mother had taught her before the rogues came and destroyed everything. "I'm a healer, and you're all injured, and I know you don't know me, and you have no reason to trust me. But please, please let me help you before it's too late, and you all freeze to death in this cave while that storm rages outside." The massive blind alpha wolf went completely still at the sound of her voice, his clouded eyes turning in her direction with an accuracy that suggested he could hear her heartbeat, could smell her fear and her determination and her desperate need to help even when it made no sense. And he made a soft sound, almost a whimper, that was so full of pain and confusion and bone-deep exhaustion that Luna felt tears spring to her eyes because she knew exactly what it felt like to be lost and alone and unable to find your way back to safety. The 12 guard wolves were watching her now, assessing her with intelligent eyes that weighed and measured and judged, trying to decide if she was a threat or a salvation, trying to determine if they should drive her away or accept her help, trying to figure out if this strange Omega with silver hair and pale skin was an enemy or an answer to prayers they'd stopped believing would be heard. The blind alpha made his decision before his guards could, stumbling toward Luna with jerky, uncoordinated movements that spoke of fever and infection and magic poisoning, closing the distance between them in a way that should have been threatening, but somehow wasn't. And when he reached her, He simply stopped and sat, his massive head tilting up toward her face that he couldn't see, his clouded eyes searching for something he'd lost. And Luna understood in that moment that this wasn't just any alpha, wasn't just any wolf. This was someone important, someone powerful, someone whose death would matter in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. She dropped to her knees in front of him without fear, her hands already reaching for his wounded shoulder with the confidence of someone who'd been healing creatures since she was old enough to hold a bandage. And she began to speak in a low, soothing cadence that described everything she was doing, so he would know where she was and what was happening, giving him back some small measure of control in a situation where he'd lost all sense of direction and safety. "I'm going to touch your shoulder now," Luna murmured, her fingers gentle as they probed the infected wound that was hot to the touch and oozing poison that smelled like dark magic and old silver. "It's going to hurt, and I'm sorry for that. But I need to see how deep this goes and what we're dealing with. And then I'm going to gather some herbs from outside if I can find them in this storm. And I'm going to make a poultice that will draw out the infection and stop the spread of whatever poison is in your system." The alpha wolf remained perfectly still under her hands, his entire being focused on her voice, on the gentle confidence of her touch, on the promise of relief from pain that had been his constant companion for what must have been days based on the severity of the infection. And Luna felt something shift in the air between them, something she didn't understand and didn't have time to analyze, something that felt like recognition and destiny, and the click of puzzle pieces finally finding their proper places after being scattered for far too long. The 12 guard wolves relaxed their defensive postures slightly, accepting her presence if not fully trusting it, and Luna took that as permission to do what she did best, to heal and mend and fix what was broken, to prove once again that her cursed appearance had nothing to do with the gift that lived in her hands and her heart and her soul. And as she began the desperate work of trying to save 13 wolves from death in a cave during a magical storm, she had no idea that she'd just altered the course of her entire life, that the blind alpha wolf sitting so trustingly beneath her gentle hands was actually the alpha king of the Northern Crown Kingdom, that his guards were the most elite warriors in the realm, and that the moment she'd chosen to help instead of run, she'd set in motion events that would transform her from a cursed, rejected Omega into the most important wolf in the entire kingdom. But that revelation would come later, after she'd fought through the night to keep them all alive, after she'd given everything she had to creatures she didn't know, after she'd proven once again that compassion was stronger than fear and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was choose to care when every rational instinct told you to protect yourself instead. The storm raged outside the cave entrance with a fury that seemed almost personal, almost vengeful, as if nature itself was angry at Luna for daring to interfere with whatever dark plan had been set in motion to trap these magnificent wolves in this isolated place where they would freeze and bleed and die without anyone ever knowing what had happened to them. But Luna pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the immediate crisis in front of her, on the 13 injured wolves who were depending on her to save them when she could barely save herself most days. She worked through the night with a determination born of desperation and loneliness and the bone-deep need to prove that her existence had meaning beyond the curse everyone claimed she carried. Her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she cleaned wounds and applied pressure to bleeding gashes and assessed the damage that had been done by whatever ambush had brought these elite warriors to their knees. And all the while, she kept talking in that soft, steady voice that seemed to be the only thing keeping the blind alpha from complete panic. "Your shoulder wound is deep but clean, which means we can work with it," Luna murmured as she carefully cleaned the infected injury with snow she'd melted using her body heat, her fingers gentle despite the urgency of the situation. "The poison in your system is dark magic mixed with silver. I can smell it even through the blood and infection, which means someone wanted to make absolutely sure you didn't survive this attack. But they didn't count on you being strong enough to last this long, or stubborn enough to keep fighting when most wolves would have given up hours ago." The alpha made a soft sound that might have been agreement or might have been pain, his massive body trembling under her hands in a way that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with the fever that was burning through him like wildfire, cooking him from the inside out and threatening to shut down his vital organs if she couldn't get the temperature under control soon. She'd managed to gather a handful of herbs before the storm had reached its full fury, had risked her own life stumbling through the blinding snow to find the feverfew and yarrow and wintergreen that grew near the cave entrance, and now she was crushing them between her palms with fierce concentration, mixing them with snow and a few drops of her own blood, because blood magic was the only thing strong enough to counter the dark poison that was killing this magnificent alpha wolf, one labored breath at a time. Her grandmother had taught her blood healing before she died, had warned her never to use it unless absolutely necessary, because it would drain her own life force and leave her vulnerable. But Luna had stopped caring about her own vulnerability somewhere around the time the Shadowmere pack had banished her for being cursed, had stopped believing she had anything worth protecting when no one else seemed to think her life had value. The poultice she created was crude and rushed, and probably not as effective as it would have been if she'd had proper tools and a fully stocked healing room instead of a freezing cave, and ingredients gathered in a deadly storm. But it would have to be enough because there was no other option, no backup plan, no rescue coming for any of them. Luna pressed the mixture deep into the alpha's shoulder wound, ignoring his whimper of pain and the way his entire body went rigid with agony, keeping up her steady stream of narration so he would know what was happening and why it hurt so badly, explaining that the poultice needed to draw out the poison, and that meant burning away the infected tissue, and that yes, it was excruciating, but it was also necessary if he wanted to survive until morning. "I know it hurts," she whispered, her free hand stroking the soft fur of his neck, in a gesture that was meant to comfort but also to ground herself, to remind herself that she was helping and not harming. "I know you want me to stop, and I wish I could, but if I don't get this poison out of your system right now, you'll be dead before sunrise, and I didn't follow those distress howls through a magical storm just to watch you die in front of me." The 12 guard wolves were watching her work with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness, their various colored eyes tracking her every movement as if trying to determine whether she was truly trying to help their alpha or if this was some elaborate trick to finish what the ambush had started. And Luna couldn't entirely blame them for their suspicion, because she was a stranger, an unknown Omega with no pack affiliation and no reason to risk her life for wolves she'd never met. She moved from the alpha to the guards once she was satisfied that the poultice was working. Once she saw the angry red inflammation around his wound start to recede and the fever tremors begin to ease slightly, and she worked her way through all 12 of them with methodical care, cleaning wounds and binding injuries, and offering what comfort she could with gentle touches and soft words that seemed to ease their pain in ways that went beyond the physical. 3 of the guards had deep gashes across their sides that looked like claw marks from other wolves, evidence of the betrayal that must have preceded this ambush, because loyal pack members didn't attack their own elite guards unless something had gone terribly wrong at the highest levels of pack politics. 2 others were showing severe signs of hypothermia despite their thick winter coats, their body temperatures dangerously low, and their breathing shallow enough that Luna feared they might slip into unconsciousness and never wake up. So she built up the fire she'd managed to coax to life using dried moss and dead branches and the last of her emergency tinder, feeding it carefully until the flames were strong enough to warm the cave and drive back some of the deadly cold that was seeping in through every crack and crevice. The other 7 guards were exhausted, but relatively uninjured, though they all showed signs of magical drain, that particular kind of bone-deep weariness that came from fighting dark magic that actively worked to suppress a wolf's natural healing abilities and drain their energy reserves until there was nothing left but an empty shell. Luna worked through the night without rest, her own body screaming for sleep and warmth and food, but she ignored those needs the way she'd learned to ignore so many physical discomforts over the past 2 years of survival living, focusing instead on keeping her patients alive and stable and as comfortable as possible given their circumstances. She sang to them as she worked, old Omega lullabies that her mother had taught her before the rogues came. Songs about the moon goddess and silver light and finding your way home even when the path was dark and treacherous. And she noticed that the blind Alpha seemed to calm whenever she sang, his clouded eyes turning toward her voice with an accuracy that suggested he was tracking her through the cave, using nothing but sound and scent and some 6th sense that Alphas possessed, but Omegas could only dream about. Silver moon, silver light, guide us through the endless night. Luna sang softly, her voice hoarse from hours of talking and the cold air that was making her throat raw. When the darkness comes to call, catch us gently if we fall, for we are children of your grace, seeking home, seeking place, and though the world may turn away, your love will guide us to the day. It was a children's song, simple and sweet, and probably ridiculous to be singing to a group of elite warriors who'd seen more battle and bloodshed than Luna could imagine. But something about the melody seemed to ease the tension in the cave, seemed to remind all of them that they were still alive and still had a chance of surviving this nightmare if they could just hold on until the storm passed and help could arrive. The blind Alpha had moved closer to her as the night wore on, had positioned himself so that he was always within touching distance, and Luna found herself unconsciously reaching out to stroke his fur whenever she passed by, offering reassurance through touch, because words could only do so much when someone was trapped in darkness and pain and confusion. She noticed that his breathing would steady when she touched him, that the tremors racking his body would ease slightly, and some distant part of her mind wondered at this connection they seemed to be forming. This unusual bond that was developing between a cursed Omega and a blind Alpha, who probably didn't even know she existed beyond being the warm voice and gentle hands that were keeping him alive. Luna had been alone for so long, had been rejected and abandoned and told she was worthless so many times that genuine connection felt foreign and dangerous and wonderful all at once, and she found herself wanting to protect this feeling, to hold on to it for as long as possible before reality intruded and reminded her that she was nobody, and he was clearly somebody important, and their worlds would never intersect beyond this one desperate night in a cave during a storm. Dawn came slowly, the gray light filtering through the cave entrance, revealing the full extent of the carnage that Luna had been working with all night. The blood-stained stone floor, and the exhausted wolves, and the remains of her healing supplies scattered everywhere like evidence of a battle she'd somehow managed to win against impossible odds. The storm had finally begun to ease, the howling wind dropping to a manageable level, and the snow falling in gentle flurries instead of the blinding sheets that had made visibility impossible during the darkest hours. And Luna felt something in her chest unclench slightly at the realization that they'd made it, that all 13 wolves were still breathing, and the worst of the crisis seemed to have passed. She was exhausted beyond measure, her body shaking with cold and fatigue, and the after effects of blood magic that had drained more of her life force than she'd intended to give. But she couldn't rest yet, not until she was sure her patients were stable and not going to take a sudden turn for the worse when she wasn't watching. The blind Alpha had finally fallen into what looked like genuine sleep rather than fever-induced unconsciousness, his massive body curled protectively around the space where Luna had been sitting, as if even in sleep he was trying to keep her close and safe and warm. She studied him in the growing light, taking in details she'd been too busy to notice during the frantic night, noticing the battle scars that marked his silver fur and spoke of years of fighting and surviving and protecting others, seeing the way his muscles were still tense even in sleep, as if he was ready to spring into action at the first sign of danger, understanding that this was a wolf who'd been trained from birth to be a warrior and a leader, and who was probably struggling with the vulnerability that came from not being able to see threats or defend himself effectively. Luna reached out without thinking, her hand gentle as she touched the fur between his ears, and she felt him relax under her touch in a way that made her heart ache with emotions she didn't want to examine too closely. Emotions that whispered dangerous things about connection and belonging, and the possibility of mattering to someone who mattered to the world. That's when she heard it, the sound that made her blood run cold and her survival instincts scream at her to run, to hide, to do anything except stay in this cave where she would be trapped and vulnerable. The sound of voices approaching through the snow, multiple voices speaking in the clipped, professional tones of soldiers on a mission. And Luna knew with absolute certainty that the rescue party had finally arrived to search for their missing king and his elite guard. She should have been relieved, should have been grateful that help was coming, and she could finally rest and let someone else take over the burden of keeping these wolves alive. But instead, she felt a creeping dread because she knew what happened when pack wolves found cursed Omegas tending to their injured leaders, knew the accusations that would follow, knew they would assume she'd caused the injuries rather than healed them because that's what everyone always assumed about the ghost girl with silver hair and violet gray eyes who brought death and misfortune wherever she went. Luna tried to pull away from the sleeping Alpha, tried to put distance between herself and the wolves who would soon discover her presence. But the moment she moved, his eyes snapped open and his head lifted with alarm, those clouded gray eyes searching for her even though he couldn't see. And he made a sound that was almost a whine, almost a plea, that seemed to be begging her not to leave him alone in his darkness. "I have to go," Luna whispered urgently, her heart breaking at the distress she could see in every line of his body. "Your pack is coming, and they can't find me here with you like this. They'll think I hurt you. They'll blame me for the ambush and the injuries, and they won't believe that I was trying to help. And I can't go through another rejection, another banishment. I just can't." But even as she spoke the words, she knew she wasn't going anywhere, because the 12 guard wolves had woken at the sound of approaching voices, and they'd moved to block the cave entrance, not to keep threats out, but to keep Luna in, their intelligent eyes making it clear that they had no intention of letting their healer disappear before their king could properly thank her or understand what she'd done for them. One of the largest guards, a wolf with golden brown fur and amber eyes that seemed to see straight through her defenses, suddenly shifted to human form in a fluid movement that left him naked and vulnerable, but somehow still commanding. And Luna averted her eyes with a sharp intake of breath, because she'd been living alone for so long that seeing a naked male form was shocking and intimate in ways she wasn't prepared to handle. "Please don't be afraid," the man said, his voice surprisingly gentle for someone who looked like he could break her in half without effort. "You saved our king's life and the lives of every wolf in this cave, and we will not allow you to leave before we can repay that debt, before we can ensure your safety and offer you the protection and honor you deserve for your courage and compassion." Luna wanted to argue, wanted to explain that she didn't deserve protection or honor or anything except to be left alone to return to her cottage and her solitary existence. But before she could form words, the voices outside grew louder, and a group of at least 20 wolves burst into the cave entrance, all of them shifting to human form in rapid succession and filling the small space with the press of bodies and the weight of authority and power. A tall man with dark hair and sharp features stepped forward, his eyes scanning the cave and taking in the scene with the swift assessment of someone trained to evaluate tactical situations. And Luna saw the exact moment his gaze landed on her, saw the confusion and suspicion that flickered across his face as he tried to understand why a strange Omega with silver hair was kneeling beside their king with blood on her hands and exhaustion written in every line of her body. "Who are you?" the man demanded, his voice carrying the weight of command and the edge of threat. "And what have you done to His Majesty?" Luna opened her mouth to explain, to defend herself, to somehow make this man understand that she'd helped rather than harmed, but no words would come because she was too tired and too scared and too convinced that no matter what she said, he would believe the worst of her, the way everyone always believed the worst of the cursed Omega who looked like death and brought misfortune. But before she could force herself to speak, before the situation could escalate into accusations and violence and everything Luna feared most in this world, the blind Alpha moved, pulling himself to his feet with obvious effort and positioning his massive silver wolf body directly between Luna and the newcomers, his clouded eyes fixed on nothing but his intent crystal clear in every protective line of his stance. The golden brown wolf, who'd shifted to human form, stepped forward quickly, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace and explanation, his voice carrying urgency as he addressed the commander of the rescue party with the familiarity of old friendship and shared history. "Captain Theron, stand down," the naked man said firmly, and Luna realized with a start that this must be one of the king's most trusted advisors based on the authority in his voice. This woman saved His Majesty's life and all of ours. She worked through the night to heal our wounds and counter the dark magic poison that was killing the king. And if you make one move to threaten or harm her, you'll have to go through every wolf in this cave who owes her their lives. The commander, Theron, looked between his friend and the defensive Alpha and the exhausted Omega with silver hair, trying to piece together a story that made sense, trying to understand how this situation had come to be. And Luna could see the exact moment he noticed the king's protective stance, the way the blind Alpha was refusing to let anyone near her, the way his entire body was radiating a possessiveness that went beyond simple gratitude. "She's his mate," Theron breathed, the words falling into the sudden silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and disbelief that spread through the assembled wolves with the force of a physical blow. And Luna felt her world tilt sideways, because that couldn't be true, couldn't be possible. She was cursed and broken, and no one's mate, especially not the mate of someone as important as a king. But even as she tried to deny it, even as she tried to reject the possibility, she felt something click into place in her chest, felt a pull toward the blind Alpha that had nothing to do with healing and everything to do with destiny. and she realized with a terror that stole her breath and a hope that she didn't dare acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, the moon goddess had finally decided to show mercy to the ghost girl who'd been wandering alone for far too long. The silence that followed Theron's declaration stretched out like a living thing, heavy and oppressive, and filled with implications that Luna couldn't begin to process because her mind was still stuck on those two impossible words. His mate! Words that should have filled her with joy, but instead filled her with a terror so profound it made her previous fears seem like minor anxieties in comparison, because being the mate of an ordinary wolf would have been overwhelming enough, but being the mate of a blind king who ruled an entire kingdom and commanded armies and made decisions that affected thousands of lives, that was so far beyond anything she could have imagined for herself that it felt like a cruel joke the moon goddess was playing on the cursed Omega, who'd spent 2 years convincing herself that she was meant to die alone. The blind Alpha, this magnificent silver wolf who'd trusted her touch and her voice through the darkest hours of the night, made a soft sound that might have been confirmation or might have been question. His massive head turning toward her with those clouded gray eyes that couldn't see her face, but somehow seemed to see straight through to her soul. And Luna felt that pull again, stronger now that someone had named it. That invisible thread connecting her heart to his in ways that defied logic and reason and everything she thought she knew about how the world worked. Theron stepped forward slowly, his hands still raised in that universal gesture of peace, his sharp features softening slightly as he took in Luna's obvious distress and the protective stance of his king, who was refusing to let anyone near the Omega who'd saved his life. And when he spoke again, his voice was gentler, more careful, as if he understood that he was dealing with something fragile and precious that could shatter if handled too roughly. "My lady, I apologize for the abrupt nature of my statement, but I've known His Majesty since we were pups training together in the Royal Guard, and I've never seen him respond to anyone the way he's responding to you right now. Not even before he lost his sight 6 months ago in the battle that nearly killed him, and the mate bond is the only explanation that makes sense for this level of protectiveness and connection after only one night together." Luna wanted to deny it. Wanted to explain that she couldn't possibly be anyone's true mate because she'd already been marked twice before, and both males had died within hours, and everyone knew she was cursed. But before she could form the words, the naked advisor who'd first shifted to human form moved closer with slow, deliberate steps that wouldn't startle the king or trigger his protective instincts. "Your Majesty, it's Kyle," the advisor said quietly, his voice pitched to carry only to the Alpha's sensitive ears. "The rescue party has arrived, and we need to get you back to the palace where the royal healers can examine you properly and ensure that the poison has been fully purged from your system. But before we can move you, we need to know if you're able to walk or if we need to fashion a travois to carry you. And we also need to know what you want us to do about the woman who saved your life, because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've claimed her as your mate, even if neither of you has fully acknowledged what that means yet." The blind Alpha made a sound that was definitely confirmation this time, a low rumble that vibrated through his massive chest and carried the weight of absolute certainty. And then something extraordinary happened. Something that made every wolf in the cave suck in a shocked breath and stare in disbelief at what they were witnessing. Because the king shifted to human form for the first time since the ambush, his body flowing from wolf to man in a transformation that should have been smooth and effortless, but was instead labored and painful because of the injuries and the poison and the exhaustion of fighting for survival all night. He stood before them, naked and magnificent, and clearly struggling to remain upright, his body covered in scars that spoke of a lifetime of battle, and his silver hair falling around his shoulders in tangles that caught the morning light filtering through the cave entrance. And Luna couldn't help but stare, because he was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. Beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful. All sharp edges and barely controlled power, and a vulnerability that made her want to reach out and touch him just to prove he was real. But it was his eyes that captured her attention and held it with an intensity that made breathing difficult. Those clouded gray eyes that couldn't see her, but were fixed on her face with such focus and longing that she felt stripped bare under his sightless gaze, felt like he was seeing parts of her that she'd kept hidden for years because showing them to the world had only ever resulted in pain and rejection and loss. "Please, don't go," the king said, his voice rough and raw from hours of being unable to speak in wolf form, from the pain and the fever and the desperation of not knowing if he would survive the night. And those 3 words carried more weight than any royal decree or alpha command possibly could, because they were a plea rather than an order, a request rather than a demand, an acknowledgement that she had the power to walk away, and he couldn't stop her, even though it would destroy something vital in him if she did. "I know you're afraid. I can hear your heart racing and smell your fear on the air. And I know this is overwhelming, and you probably think I'm insane for claiming you as my mate when I can't even see your face, when I don't know anything about you except that you have silver hair and you sing like angels and your hands are gentle enough to heal wounds that should have killed me. But I'm asking you to stay, to come back to the palace with me, to give us a chance to understand what the moon goddess is trying to tell us by bringing us together in this cave during a storm that was designed to kill me." Luna felt tears burning in her eyes, felt them spilling down her cheeks in hot tracks that she couldn't control, because no one had ever asked her to stay before. No one had ever made it sound like her presence mattered, or like her leaving would cause genuine pain, and she wanted so desperately to believe that this was real, that this magnificent blind king actually wanted her for more than just her healing abilities. That maybe the moon goddess had finally decided to give the cursed Omega a chance at happiness after years of suffering and loneliness. "I'm nobody," Luna whispered, her voice breaking on the words she'd repeated to herself so many times they'd become her identity. "I'm a cursed Omega with no pack and no family and no value except for a healing gift that everyone fears, because they think it's connected to the deaths of the 2 males who tried to mark me before you. And I've been living alone in a cottage in the Whispering Woods for 2 years because I was banished from my pack for being too strange, too pale, too different. And if you knew the truth about me, if you could see what I really look like and understand what being connected to me might cost you, you would take back those words and send me away before I can bring my curse down on your head and destroy everything you've built." The king took a step toward her, swaying slightly, but refusing to let his injuries stop him from closing the distance between them. And Luna found herself frozen in place, unable to move toward him or away from him, caught in that terrible moment of indecision where fear and hope waged war in her chest, and neither side was winning. "I don't care what you look like," the king said firmly, his clouded eyes searching for her even though he couldn't see. "I will never see your face with my eyes. We'll never know if your hair is the color of moonlight, or starlight, or winter frost. We'll never be able to tell if your eyes are gray, or blue, or some color that doesn't have a name. But I can hear the kindness in your voice when you explained everything you were doing, so I wouldn't be afraid. I can feel the gentleness in your hands when you touched me, like I was something precious instead of something broken. And I can sense the strength in your soul that kept fighting to save 13 wolves when any rational person would have run away and saved themselves. And those are the things that matter. Those are the things I can perceive even without sight. And those are the reasons I'm asking you to stay. Theron cleared his throat quietly, drawing their attention back to the reality of 20 rescue party members crowding the cave entrance and watching this intensely private moment with varying expressions of shock and curiosity and dawning understanding. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of practical concerns that needed to be addressed regardless of mate bonds and emotional revelations. Your Majesty, we need to get you back to the palace before the dark magic in your system has a chance to resurge. And the woman needs medical attention as well, because I can see from here that she's exhausted beyond measure and probably suffering from magical drain if she used blood healing to counter the poison. So I'm suggesting that we transport both of you together so you can continue to provide each other comfort and support during the journey. And we can sort out the details of what this means for the kingdom and the succession and all the political complications once we're certain that you're both going to survive the next 48 hours. The king nodded once, sharply, his jaw set in the stubborn line of someone who'd made a decision and wasn't going to be swayed from it regardless of what obstacles might arise. And then he held out his hand in Luna's direction, his palm open and fingers slightly spread in an invitation that was somehow both vulnerable and commanding. Come with me, the king said simply, those 3 words carrying the weight of a promise and a plea and a declaration all rolled into one. Not because you have to, not because I'm ordering you as a king, but because I'm asking you as a man who spent the worst night of his life trapped in darkness and pain and fear. And the only thing that kept me sane was your voice and your touch and your presence. And I'm not ready to lose that yet. Not ready to go back to being alone in my blindness. Not ready to face my kingdom and my responsibilities without knowing that you're somewhere nearby if I need you. Luna looked at his outstretched hand, at the scars that marked his knuckles, and the slight tremor that betrayed his weakness, and the stubborn determination that kept him standing when he should have been flat on his back, recovering. And she thought about all the years she'd spent alone, all the times she'd prayed for someone to see her as something more than a curse. All the nights she'd cried herself to sleep, wondering if she would ever matter to anyone. She thought about the 2 males who'd died after marking her, about Marcus, who'd been kind, but never truly understood her, about Cain, who'd been persistent, but never truly seen her. And she thought about how neither of them had ever asked her what she wanted, or how she felt, or if she was afraid, had never given her a choice beyond accepting or rejecting their claims, had never treated her like an equal partner in the bond they were trying to form. This blind king, this man she'd known for less than 12 hours, had already shown her more respect and consideration than anyone else in her entire life, had asked instead of demanded, had acknowledged her fear instead of dismissing it, had made it clear that she had the power to walk away even though it would hurt him, and that fundamental difference, that basic recognition of her autonomy and worth, made all the difference in the world. Luna reached out slowly, her pale hand looking almost translucent in the morning light as it moved toward his, and when their fingers touched, when her palm met his and their hands clasped together with a rightness that made her breath catch, she felt it, that undeniable pull, that connection that went deeper than logic or reason or fear, that bond the moon goddess forged between souls that were meant to find each other across time and distance and impossible odds. I'll come with you, Luna said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears still streaming down her face. Not because I'm convinced this is real, or because I think I deserve to be anyone's mate, but because you asked me to stay, and no one has ever asked me that before. And because even if this all falls apart and your kingdom rejects me, and you eventually realize that I'm not worth the trouble, at least I'll know that for one night, for these few hours in this cave, I mattered to someone who mattered to the world, and that's more than I ever thought I'd have. The king's fingers tightened around hers with a strength that belied his injuries, and he pulled her closer with gentle insistence until she was standing directly in front of him, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body and smell the scent of wolf and blood, and something uniquely him that made her want to lean in and never pull away. And then he did something that made her heart stop and restart with a rhythm that felt entirely new. He raised his free hand slowly, giving her time to pull back if she wanted to. And when she didn't move, when she stayed frozen in place, watching him with wide eyes and barely breathing, he touched her face with fingers that were surprisingly gentle for someone so large and powerful, tracing the lines of her features like he was trying to create a mental image of what she looked like, mapping her cheekbones and the bridge of her nose and the curve of her lips with a reverence that made her feel beautiful for the first time in her entire life. "You're shaking," the king observed softly, his thumb brushing across her cheek and catching the tears that were falling faster now. "But I can't tell if it's from fear or exhaustion or something else, so I need you to tell me. Need you to help me understand what you're feeling, because I can't see your expressions, and I'm navigating this blind in more ways than one. And I don't want to push you too hard or move too fast or do anything that makes you uncomfortable. So please, talk to me. Tell me what you need." "I need to understand why," Luna said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why you would want someone like me when you could have anyone in your kingdom, anyone beautiful and accomplished and worthy of being queen. Why you would risk your reputation and your authority by claiming a cursed Omega that everyone will tell you to reject. Why you would choose someone you can't even see when there must be dozens of females who've been trying to catch your attention for years." The king smiled then, a small, sad expression that transformed his face from merely handsome to heartbreakingly beautiful. And when he spoke, his words carried the weight of truth and experience and a loneliness that matched her own. "Because everyone who wanted me before I lost my sight disappeared the moment they realized I was blind. Because the females who tried to catch my attention were interested in my crown and my power and my status, but never in me as a person. Because I've been ruling this kingdom for 3 years, and I've never felt more alone than I did in the months after I lost my sight and realized that everyone saw me as damaged goods, as a broken king who needed to be managed and protected rather than respected and trusted. And then you walked into that cave, and you treated me like I was still whole, still capable, still worth saving, and you didn't even know I was a king, which means you saw me, really saw me, in ways that people with perfect vision never managed to do." The journey back to the Northern Crown Palace took 3 days because the king's injuries required frequent rest stops, and Luna's magical exhaustion meant she could barely walk more than a few hours at a time without needing to sleep. And during those 3 days of slow travel through snow-covered forests and over mountain passes that took Luna's breath away with their savage beauty, she learned more about the blind king whose hand she was holding and whose future she was apparently going to share. His name was Aldrich Moonshadow. He was 25 years old and had been ruling the Northern Crown Kingdom since his parents died in a territorial dispute 5 years ago. He'd lost his sight 6 months ago in a battle against a rogue faction that had used dark magic and poisoned silver to try to assassinate him, and he'd been struggling ever since to prove to his kingdom and his council that he was still capable of ruling, despite his disability, still strong enough to protect his people, still worthy of the crown his parents had left him. Luna told him about her own past during those long walks, about parents who died when she was 5 and left her to be raised by a pack that never wanted her, about the silver hair and pale skin that made everyone whisper about curses and death omens, about Marcus and Cain, who'd marked her and died and left her convinced she was poisonous to anyone who tried to love her, about the 2 years she'd spent alone in her cottage, talking to birds and surviving on herbs and stubbornness, because dying seemed easier than facing another rejection. Aldrich listened to every word with an intensity that made her feel heard in ways she'd never experienced before, asking questions that showed he was truly trying to understand her, rather than just waiting for his turn to talk. And when she finally confessed her deepest fear, that she would somehow cause his death, the way she'd supposedly caused the others, he stopped walking and pulled her close and told her something that would change the entire trajectory of her life. "I had my advisors investigate your past while we were traveling," Aldrich said quietly, his arms wrapped around her in an embrace that felt protective and possessive and comforting all at once. "And they discovered that both Marcus and Cain were poisoned with the same dark magic silver compound that was used on me, which means their deaths weren't caused by a curse or by you or by anything except deliberate murder by someone who wanted to make sure you remained alone and vulnerable and easy to control. And my best tracker is currently hunting down the wolf responsible, a beta named Dorian, who apparently orchestrated the entire thing because he wanted to break you down until you were desperate enough to accept him as a mate." Luna felt something crack open in her chest at those words, felt 2 years of guilt and self-hatred begin to crumble under the weight of this revelation, felt the possibility of innocence and freedom and a future without the shadow of death hanging over her head. And she cried in Aldrich's arms for what felt like hours, releasing all the pain and fear and loneliness she'd been carrying for so long. The palace was more magnificent than anything Luna could have imagined. All soaring ice crystal architecture and silver marble, and windows that caught the light and transformed it into rainbows that danced across polished floors. And when they arrived, the entire court turned out to witness their king's return and to catch their first glimpse of the mysterious Omega who'd saved his life and captured his heart. Luna knew she must look terrible, still wearing her stained and torn clothes from the cave, her silver hair tangled and dirty, her pale skin marked with scratches and bruises from her ordeal. But Aldrich kept her hand clasped firmly in his as he addressed his people with the authority of a king who'd made a decision and expected it to be honored, declaring that Luna Silvercrest was his true mate, his chosen Luna, and anyone who questioned her worth or her right to stand beside him would answer to him personally. And Luna felt something shift in that moment, felt herself transform from the cursed Omega into someone who had value and purpose and a place in the world. The mating ceremony was held under the full moon 2 weeks later, after Luna had been examined by the royal healers, who confirmed that she possessed the rare soul weaver gift that only manifested in the presence of one's true mate. After Dorian had been captured and tried and executed for the murders of Marcus and Cain, after Luna had been given time to adjust to palace life and learn what it meant to be a Luna and accept that maybe, just maybe, she deserved the happiness that was being offered to her. She wore a dress of silver silk that flowed like water over her body, her long silver hair unbound and adorned with moonflowers that glowed in the darkness. And when Aldrich marked her neck with gentle teeth and the mate bond snapped fully into place, something miraculous happened that made every wolf present gasp in shock and wonder, because Luna's soul weaver gift surged through the bond with a power that made the air itself shimmer with silver light, and Aldrich's clouded gray eyes began to clear, slowly at first, and then faster, his vision returning in a rush of color and light and shapes that he hadn't seen in 6 months. The first thing he saw clearly was Luna's face, beautiful and ethereal, and exactly as perfect as he'd imagined during all those nights when he'd traced her features with his fingers and tried to picture what she looked like and the expression on his face, the wonder and joy and love that transformed his features, made Luna understand that she'd been wrong about everything, that she wasn't cursed or broken or destined to be alone, that the moon goddess had simply been waiting for the right moment to bring her together with the one person in the entire world who would see her soul before her appearance, who would value her heart before her face, who would choose her not despite her differences, but because of them. Years later, when young Omegas would come to Luna feeling lost and unwanted and convinced they were cursed, she would tell them her story about the blind wolf she saved in a cave during a magical storm, about how choosing compassion over fear had led her to a love she never thought possible, about how the things that made her different were actually the things that made her perfect for the mate the moon goddess had chosen for her. And she would watch their faces light up with hope and understanding as they realized that being different wasn't a curse, but a gift, that the right person would see their value even when the rest of the world was blind, that sometimes you had to save a life before you could save your own. If you enjoyed this tale of fated mates and unexpected love, of a cursed Omega who found her place in the world by choosing courage over safety and compassion over self-preservation, then please let me know what you thought of Luna and Aldrich's story in the comments below. Tell me which moment touched your heart the most. Share your thoughts about the power of seeing with your soul instead of your eyes. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story about werewolves and alpha kings and the transformative magic of true love, because there are so many more tales to tell about rejected mates finding redemption, broken wolves discovering healing, and cursed souls learning that sometimes the moon goddess's greatest gifts come wrapped in the strangest packages, and I want to share every single one of them with you. So hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and join me on this journey through the world of wolves and magic and love that defies all odds and expectations.